I'm 36, a woman, and if you passed me on the street, you'd probably think I had it together. Small business owner, decent house in the suburbs outside of Dallas, the kind of life that looks polished from the outside. What you wouldn't see is that I spent 8 years building something real, while the man I built it with was quietly dismantling everything behind my back. My husband and I met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming, driven, the kind of guy who made you feel like the most important person in any room he walked into. We got married after 2 years of dating, bought a house in the suburbs, and settled into what I genuinely believed was a real partnership. He had his corporate sales job. I had a small tech consulting firm I'd started using $40,000 from my grandmother's inheritance, money she left specifically for me, in my name alone, documented and deposited into my personal account a full year before we ever said, I do. I kept that paperwork, every page of it. That business grew. Slowly at first, then fast. By year 6 of our marriage, I was pulling in close to $280,000 in annual revenue. I reinvested constantly, hired 2 employees, built a client roster that took years of cold emails and 60-hour weeks to develop. My husband was supportive the way furniture is supportive. He was there. He cooked dinner sometimes. He didn't interfere. But he also didn't build it, not a single piece of it. What he did build, apparently, was a relationship with my closest friend. I found out on a Tuesday. Ordinary Tuesday. I'd come home early from a client meeting that got canceled, and his car was in the driveway at 2 p.m. on a workday. He told me that morning he'd be at the office until at least 6. I walked in through the side door out of habit. I won't describe exactly what I walked into. I'll just say that my best friend of 11 years was in my house, and she was not there to borrow a book. She left before I could say anything coherent. He stayed. He stood in the kitchen and looked at me, and the very first thing out of his mouth, the very first thing was, "We need to talk about what this means for the business." Not "I'm sorry," not even my name, the business. Like he'd already been running numbers in his head. Like this moment had already been workshopped. That sentence told me more about who he actually was than anything that had happened in the previous 8 years. I told him to get out of my house. He said it was his house too. He wasn't wrong, technically, but I said it again, and something in my voice must have landed differently that time because he left. I sat on the kitchen floor for about 20 minutes. Then I got up, made coffee, and called an attorney. The attorney I called was a woman my accountant had mentioned once in passing, specializing in high-asset divorces in Texas. I got an appointment within 48 hours. I walked in with a folder, bank statements, the original inheritance documentation, business formation papers, tax filings going back 6 years, client contracts, everything. She looked through it quietly, asked a few precise questions, and then leaned back in her chair. "You came prepared," she said. "I had a feeling I'd need to be," I told her. Here's the thing about Texas divorce law that my husband was either too arrogant or too lazy to look up before he started making plans. Texas is a community property state, but that doesn't mean everything is split down the middle. Separate property, meaning assets you brought into the marriage or inherited during it, remains yours, provided you can trace it clearly and prove it wasn't commingled. My $40,000 seed money had gone into a dedicated business account, never touched by joint funds, never mixed. The business income had been kept separate from our household account with a formality I'd maintained almost by instinct. I hadn't done it because I was planning for divorce. I'd done it because I'm organized, because my grandmother worked her whole life for that money, and I wasn't going to be careless with it. My attorney's read was straightforward. The business was strong separate property. The house was community. His 401k and my smaller retirement account would both be considered. We negotiate from there. What I didn't expect was how fast he lawyered up and who he chose. His attorney was the kind of man who sends letters with a lot of bold text and exclamation points, designed to rattle people who aren't expecting it. Within 2 weeks of me filing, I received a formal letter claiming that because I had allegedly used marital funds to support business operations, the entire company should be considered community property subject to equal division. The claim was thin. It was also the first shot across the bow, and it told me exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. Then came the dirty tricks. The first one was almost impressive in its pettiness. He started calling my clients, not threatening them. Nothing I could immediately prove was malicious. Just reaching out to check in, introducing himself as my husband, planting seeds of instability. One client, a mid-sized logistics company I'd worked with for 3 years, called me to ask if my business was going through some changes. I knew exactly what had happened. I documented it, sent it to my attorney, and kept going. The second trick was worse. He filed a motion claiming I was dissipating marital assets, essentially accusing me of draining money out of the business to hide it from the divorce proceedings. It was a delay tactic designed to freeze my business accounts pending a forensic accounting review. My attorney filed a response within days, complete with 5 years of spotless bookkeeping. The motion was denied, but it cost me 3 weeks of stress and a significant chunk in legal fees. The third one was the most personal. He reached out to my 2 employees, good people, both of them, who had been with me for years, and told them separately that the business was likely being dissolved as part of the divorce settlement, and that they might want to start looking. One of them came to me immediately and showed me the text. The other quietly started job hunting. I found out 2 months later when she gave notice. He wasn't trying to win a fair settlement. He was trying to make me bleed until I agreed to something just to make it stop. And here is where he made his biggest miscalculation. He thought I was the kind of person who would. I'm not. I sat down with my attorney after the third incident and told her I was done playing defense. I wanted to understand every option I had, every legal tool available, and I wanted to use them correctly and completely. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. First, the dissipation motion he'd filed against me. It opened a door. Because once a court starts scrutinizing financial behavior during separation, it scrutinizes both parties. My attorney immediately filed a counter-motion requesting full financial disclosure from his side, bank records, credit card statements, phone records if we could connect them to financial activity. What came back was instructive. In the 14 months before I filed for divorce, my husband had made a series of cash withdrawals, nothing individually enormous but consistent, and they added up to just over $22,000. No corresponding deposits anywhere. No explanation. He had been siphoning money from our joint account. Slowly, carefully, planning ahead. In Texas, deliberately wasting or hiding marital assets, what's legally called fraud on the community, can result in a disproportionate division of the estate. The judge has discretion to award the wronged spouse more than 50% to compensate for the dissipation. My attorney filed the fraud claim with full documentation. His attorney responded with a lot of bluster and very little substance. Second, the client contact issue. I hadn't been able to prove direct tortious interference at first, but my client, the logistics company, was willing to put in writing that my husband had contacted them, identified himself, and implied the business was in jeopardy. Combined with the text message my employee had saved, my attorney sent a formal cease and desist and attached it to a motion alerting the court to his conduct during the pendency of the divorce. Judges do not like it when one spouse conducts what looks like a campaign to sabotage the other spouse's livelihood during active proceedings. The motion landed. Third, and this one required patience, his attorney had built their entire argument around the idea that marital funds had been used to sustain my business. My attorney hired a forensic accountant. She spent 6 weeks going through every transaction, every payroll record, every operating expense. The conclusion was documented, thorough, and unambiguous. Not a single dollar of joint marital funds had ever flowed into my business. Not one. The seed capital traced cleanly back to my inheritance. The operating revenue was self-sustaining from year 2 onward. When that report landed in the opposing attorney's inbox, the tone of their correspondence changed almost immediately. But before any of that could fully play out, before the final settlement was negotiated, my husband made one more move. He showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, no warning, no attorney present. He knocked on the door like it was a casual visit. I opened it because I wanted to hear what he was going to say. "I think we should talk about settling this without the lawyers," he said. He was using the voice, the charming one, the one that used to work. "This is getting expensive for both of us. I think we can figure something out between the two of us, you know? Come to an agreement that makes sense." I looked at him for a moment. "You want me to negotiate my own settlement without legal representation," I said, "with the man who's been calling my clients and telling my employees we're shutting down." He started to say something about how that wasn't. "Don't," I said, and I closed the door. I called my attorney first thing Monday morning and told her what had happened. She noted it. Ex parte contact during a contested divorce, while not always automatically actionable, is exactly the kind of thing that builds a pattern, and we were building a very clear one. The settlement conference was scheduled for 8 weeks later. By then, the fraud on the community claim had been formally filed, the forensic accounting report was in the record, and his attorney had gone notably quiet. He walked into that conference expecting a negotiation. What he got was a presentation. The settlement conference was held in a neutral attorney's office in downtown Dallas, a long conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a table that seated 12. My husband sat across from me for the first time in 4 months, in any formal setting. He had his attorney beside him. I had mine. There was a mediator at the head of the table, a retired family court judge who had the particular energy of someone who had heard every version of every story and was not interested in theatrics. My husband walked in looking confident. That was the first thing I noticed. He'd worn a good suit. He sat down, straightened his jacket, and gave me the kind of measured nod you give someone when you're trying to project control. Like he'd already done the math and liked his number. His attorney opened by laying out their position. The business should be classified as community property based on the indirect support of the marital household. His income had covered living expenses, which had theoretically freed up my resources to build the company. It was an argument. It wasn't a strong one, but it was the one they had left after the forensic accounting report had dismantled everything else. They were asking for 50% of the business valuation, which their hired appraiser had placed at $340,000, plus an equal split of the equity in the house. The mediator listened, wrote some notes, then turned to my side of the table. My attorney didn't raise her voice once during the next 40 minutes. She didn't need to. She walked through the inheritance documentation, clean, dated, premarital, and the forensic report, which confirmed zero commingling. She presented the fraud on the community filing, $22,400 in documented cash withdrawals, no paper trail, spanning 14 months prior to my filing. She noted the cease and desist related to client contact. She referenced the text message sent to my employee. She laid each piece down on the table like she was setting a table for dinner. Methodical, unhurried. Then she said, "Given the documented fraud on the community, we are requesting that the court apply a disproportionate asset division, specifically that my client receive 100% of the business, which is her separate property, 60% of the home equity, and a full offset against her share of the marital estate equivalent to the $22,400 in dissipated funds." The room was quiet for a moment. His attorney leaned over and said something low to my husband. My husband's jaw tightened. Then he did something I genuinely did not expect. He looked directly at me, past both attorneys, past the mediator, and said, "You're really going to do this? After everything I contributed to this marriage? You're going to sit here and act like I had nothing to do with where you are?" I held his gaze. "You contributed to the household," I said. "I never disputed that. But you didn't build my business. And you didn't get to dismantle it either." "I supported you," he said, and his voice had an edge now that he wasn't bothering to smooth over. "For 8 years. You think you could have done any of this without the stability of this marriage?" "I think," I said, "that I started that company with my grandmother's money before I ever married you. Built it entirely on my own work, and then watched you spend 14 months quietly draining our joint account while you were planning to leave. So yes, I think I'm going to do this." His attorney put a hand on his arm. He shook it off. "This is insane," he said. "This is completely insane. My attorney told me we had a strong case." "Your attorney told you what you wanted to hear?" I said. I wasn't angry when I said it. I was just tired and honest. The mediator cleared his throat. "I'd suggest we take a brief recess." During the recess, I stood by the window with a cup of bad conference room coffee and looked out at the Dallas skyline. My attorney came and stood beside me. "He's rattled," she said quietly. "I know." His attorney is going to try to come back with a counter. Probably offer to drop the business claim entirely in exchange for 55 to 45 on the house and no dissipation offset. What do you think we should do? She considered it. I think we hold. The fraud claim is solid. If this goes in front of a judge, we're likely to get at least what we're asking for, possibly more. But litigation means more time and more fees. How solid is solid? The withdrawals are documented. He has no explanation for them. In Texas, a court can award up to 100% of the wasted amount back to the wronged spouse as an offset. We're only asking for dollar. That's conservative. I nodded. We hold. She went back in. I finished my coffee. The counteroffer came back almost exactly as she'd predicted. Drop the business claim, 55 to 45 house split, no dissipation offset, call it done. His attorney framed it as a gesture of good faith. My attorney didn't even look at me for confirmation before she responded. We'll accept the business classification as separate property, the 60 to 40 house split, and the $22,400 offset. That is our final position. Another recess. Longer this time. When they came back, his attorney looked like a man who had just gotten off a very unpleasant phone call. My client will accept the terms, he said. I watched my husband's face when his attorney said it. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring at the table. And for the first time since I'd found him standing in my kitchen talking about the business instead of apologizing, he looked like he understood exactly what had happened. He had walked into that marriage thinking that proximity to something meant ownership of it. He had assumed that because he was there, present adjacent, inhabiting the same house, that what I'd built was somehow also his. And when the marriage fell apart, his first instinct wasn't remorse. It was acquisition. He had calculated what he could take. What he hadn't calculated was that I had 8 years of paperwork. The final divorce decree was signed 11 weeks later. I retained 100% of the business. I received 60% of the home equity, which, after the offset, effectively meant he walked away with a check that barely covered his moving expenses. His 401k was split evenly, as was mine. On paper, it looked like a settlement. In reality, it was a complete and total rout, achieved entirely through documentation, patience, and the refusal to be rattled by a man who had mistaken charm for leverage. But there was still one thing left. The employee he'd contacted, the one who had quietly started job hunting and eventually given notice, her name came up again 2 months after the decree was signed. She reached out to me directly. She'd landed somewhere else, was doing fine, but she wanted me to know something. When my husband had texted her about the business dissolving, he had also mentioned, offhandedly, like it was already decided, that he was working on acquiring the client list as part of the settlement. That he had, apparently, already reached out to at least 2 of my major clients, suggesting he was starting a consulting firm and that they might want to get ahead of any transitions. He had been trying to poach my clients before the divorce was even finalized, using information about my business that he had access to only because we were married. I took that information straight to my attorney. What followed was not a court case. It was a demand letter, detailed, specific, and backed by documentation my former employee was willing to provide. The legal theory was straightforward: tortious interference with business relations and, potentially, misappropriation of confidential business information. In Texas, both are actionable. The demand letter requested $45,000 in damages, a conservative estimate of the potential business impact, and full cessation of any contact with my clients. His new attorney, because he'd apparently burned through the first one, responded within 10 days. They settled for $38,000. He wrote me a check. Personally, I made sure of that. Not a wire transfer. A physical check because I wanted the paper. I deposited it on a Thursday afternoon, and when the teller handed me my receipt, I stood in the lobby of that bank for a moment and just let myself feel the specific, clean satisfaction of a thing being finished. Let me tell you about my former best friend because I've been deliberately holding that thread until now. She didn't reach out after I caught them. Not that day, not the week after, not during the 4 months of divorce proceedings. 11 years of friendship. Birthdays, cross-country moves, emergency phone calls at 2 a.m., and when everything collapsed, she went completely silent. I told myself I was fine with that. that her silence was actually a gift because it meant I didn't have to decide what to do with her. Then, about 3 weeks after the divorce decree was signed, she texted me. It was a long message. I won't reconstruct the whole thing, but the shape of it was familiar, the kind of apology that's structured around the apologizer's feelings rather than the impact of what they did. There was a lot of, I was in a really dark place and you deserve to know that it wasn't planned, and near the end something that made me put my phone down and stare at the ceiling for a full minute. I think part of me always felt like you had so much, the business, the house, everything going right, and I was struggling, and he made me feel seen. I know that's not an excuse. I just want you to understand. She wanted me to understand that she had betrayed me because my life looked too good from the outside. I read it twice. Then I typed back 4 words. I hope you heal. And I blocked her number. Not out of rage. Not even out of hurt. Exactly. That particular hurt had already moved through me and out the other side during those months of depositions and forensic accounting and settlement conferences. I blocked her because that message told me everything I needed to know about where she was and where I was, and the distance between those two places was simply too far to cross. Some bridges don't get rebuilt. Some of them you walk away from and you don't look back, and that's not bitterness. That's just clarity. Now let me tell you what happened to my husband, because this is the part you've been waiting for, and I'm not going to shortchange it. He had positioned himself in his own mind as someone who was about to come out of this divorce with half of something I'd spent 8 years building. He had a plan. He'd been executing it for over a year. The quiet cash withdrawals, the groundwork laid with my clients, the contact with my employees. He had imagined a version of events where he walked away with a meaningful chunk of my business value and a head start on a competing firm built on my client relationships. Instead, he walked away with a check that barely covered his moving deposit, a $38,000 settlement payment going the wrong direction, and a professional reputation in our industry that was now attached to words like litigation and tortious interference. Word travels in small professional communities. It travels faster when there's a demand letter involved. The consulting firm he'd apparently been quietly planning never launched. 2 of the clients he'd approached came back to me. One of them directly, one through a referral, and told me they'd found the whole thing strange and off-putting. One of them actually apologized to me, which I told her absolutely was not necessary, but which I privately appreciated more than I let on. He moved into an apartment about 40 minutes outside of Dallas. I know this only because a mutual acquaintance mentioned it in passing. I didn't ask. He's apparently still in corporate sales. Still doing fine in the narrow sense of the word. Still, as far as I can tell, fundamentally the same person who stood in my kitchen after I caught him and immediately started calculating what the situation meant for the business. Some people don't change. That's not a dramatic conclusion. It's just a fact. Here's what I want to say about the business, because it's the part of the story I'm most protective of. My second employee, the one who came to me immediately with a text message, who never wavered, who showed up every single day through all of it, I gave her a raise the week the decree was signed. A real one, not a token gesture.
And I told her exactly why.
She cried a little. I didn't, but only because I was holding it together by habit at that point. The client roster is intact. Revenue this year is tracking above last year. I hired a 3rd person in January, someone new, someone who doesn't know any of this history, who just sees a small firm with good clients and a decent culture, and a boss who keeps meticulous records. The $38,000 settlement check went into the business operating account. My grandmother's inheritance had been the seed. That check, in some strange and satisfying way, felt like the harvest. I still own 100% of something I built from scratch with my own hands and my grandmother's belief in me. Nobody gets to take that. Not through charm, not through manipulation, not through a year of calculated quiet sabotage. Not through bold text demand letters or motions to freeze my accounts or texts to my employees designed to make them feel unstable. I kept every piece of paper. I kept my composure when it counted. And I let the documentation do what no amount of arguing ever could. I let it speak, clearly and completely, in a language that left no room for spin. There's one more thing. About 6 weeks after everything was finalized, I was going through an old box of paperwork. The kind of box you accumulate over a marriage, full of warranty cards and old insurance documents and birthday cards you kept for reasons you can't fully explain anymore. Near the bottom, I found a card my husband had given me on our 3rd anniversary. It was one of those nice ones, thick cardstock, handwritten inside. He'd written, "I am so proud of what you're building. I hope you know I see it." I held that card for a moment, then I put it in the recycling bin. Not angrily,
Just practically.
because that version of him, if he ever truly existed, hadn't been the one in that settlement conference room staring at the table while his attorney said the words he didn't want to hear. And I'm not interested in grieving a person who may have only ever been a performance. What I am interested in is the version of myself that walked out of that conference room, drove home, changed into comfortable clothes, and made dinner, real dinner, not takeout, and ate it alone in my own kitchen in my own house, and felt something I can only describe as spacious. Like a room with all the furniture finally arranged the way it should have been the whole time.
That's the whole story.
No edits, no updates. Just what happened, start to finish, to a 36-year-old woman in Dallas who kept her paperwork and refused to be rattled. If you stuck around through all 4 parts, you already know whether you're the kind of person who fights for what they built. So go ahead and subscribe, because clearly you have excellent taste in knowing when someone's not going to back down.